The weight of recognition. The locker room held its breath. 3 teenage players froze mid-conversation, their eyes darting between the gun and the door. The assistant coach, a nervous man named Palacios, pressed himself against the wall like he could disappear into the concrete. But Miguel Torres, Roberto Silva, whatever name he wore now, didn't flinch. That smile never wavered. If anything, it widened. "Gentlemen," Torres said, his voice carrying that same smooth confidence Carlos remembered from the warehouse 24 years ago. "Perhaps we could have some privacy?" The players bolted. Palacios followed, stumbling over his own feet. The door slammed shut, leaving only the echo of running footsteps in the hallway outside. Carlos kept the Beretta steady. His hands hadn't shaken like this since Elena's funeral. "You remember that night in Palermo?" Torres tilted his head, studying Carlos with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. Slowly, recognition dawned across his features. "Ah, the faithful watchdog. I thought you were dead. You left me to die." "Business decision. Nothing personal." Torres adjusted his expensive cufflinks. "Though I must say you've aged terribly. All that guilt, perhaps?" The weight of the gun felt familiar in Carlos's grip. How many times had he drawn it to protect Diego? Countless. But he'd never fired it, not once. Even when the Napoli Ultras cornered them outside that nightclub in 1991, even when that Russian oligarch's men broke into Diego's hotel room in Moscow, Carlos had always found another way. But this wasn't about protecting Diego anymore. "Elena was 19, Carlos said. "She had nothing to do with your business. Your daughter was naive, thought she could save her father's precious football star by warning him about the product." Torres shrugged. "I couldn't allow that kind of interference." The memory crashed over Carlos like a wave. Elena in her university uniform, eyes bright with determination, telling him she'd discovered something about Diego's new supplier, how she'd traced the dealer through her journalism contacts, how she planned to expose him. Carlos had begged her to stay away, had promised to handle it himself. He'd been too late. "She recorded you," Carlos said. "Had photos of your operation." Had being the operative phrase. Torres reached into his jacket. Carlos tensed, finger tightening on the trigger. But Torres only pulled out a cigarette case. "May I?" "Old habits. Keep your hands visible." Torres lit the cigarette with deliberate slowness. "You know what your mistake was, Carlos? You always thought you were protecting Maradona from the world. But you never considered that sometimes the world needed protecting from him. Diego was sick. You made him worse. I gave him exactly what he wanted," Torres finished, exhaling smoke toward the flickering fluorescent lights. "Just like I gave your daughter exactly what she was looking for, a story, though perhaps not the ending she expected." The fluorescent bulb above them stuttered, casting intermittent shadows across Torres's face. In those brief moments of darkness, Carlos saw another face entirely, Elena's, the way she'd looked that last morning. 24 years dissolved like sugar in rain. She'd been making mate in their small kitchen, humming something by Charlie Garcia while the kettle heated. The Buenos Aires dawn filtered through their apartment window, painting everything in soft gold. Carlos had watched her from the doorway, memorizing the moment without knowing why, the way she tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, the concentrated furrow of her brow as she arranged the bombilla just so. "Papa, you look like someone died," she'd laughed, catching his reflection in the window. "It's just university. I'll be back tonight." But she hadn't come back. Not that night. Not ever. "You're trembling," Torres observed, flicking ash onto the concrete floor. "Age or guilt? Hard to tell at your vintage." Carlos forced his grip steady. The Beretta felt heavier now, weighted with decades of what-ifs. Through the thin walls, he could hear the distant sounds of practice continuing, boys calling to each other in the eternal language of football. Here at the Esperanza Youth Academy, he'd found something resembling peace in protecting young dreams instead of broken legends. These kids reminded him daily that not everything beautiful had to end in tragedy, until today. "You know what I find fascinating?" Torres continued, settling onto a wooden bench with the casual air of a man discussing weather. How you ended up here, of all places. Carlos El Toro Mendez, the man who once stood between Maradona and the world, reduced to watching over children who'll never amount to anything. They're good kids. They're poor kids. There's a difference. Torres gestured around the modest locker room. Peeling paint, mismatched lockers, the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant fighting a losing battle against adolescent sweat, though I suppose that's fitting. You always were attracted to lost causes. The academy had been Carlos's sanctuary for 4 years now. Director Vega had hired him, despite his lack of formal education, seeing something in the weathered ex-bodyguard that others missed. "We don't need credentials," she'd said during his interview. "We need someone who understands what it means to protect something precious." Maria Vega. The thought of her sent a fresh spike of panic through Carlos's chest. She'd be in her office now, reviewing applications for the new youth program. If she heard the commotion, she'd come running. That was her way, always putting herself between danger and the children she'd dedicated her life to protecting. "Ah," Torres smiled, reading something in Carlos's expression. "There is someone you care about here. I wondered what kept you motivated at your age. This has nothing to do with anyone else, doesn't it?" Torres stood slowly, hands visible, but his movement carried the predatory grace Carlos remembered. 24 years is a long time to carry a grudge, Carlos. Most men would have moved on, found peace. But here you are, gun drawn in a children's locker room, proving that some wounds never heal. Outside, a whistle blew, Coach Ramirez ending the midday scrimmage. Soon the corridors would fill with sweaty teenagers, their voices echoing off concrete walls as they argued about penalty calls and planned their evening adventures. Normal sounds. Safe sounds, the rhythms of a world Carlos had worked hard to preserve. "You want to know why I'm really here?" Torres took another drag, studying Carlos through the smoke. "It wasn't coincidence that brought me to Esperanza Academy. Your beloved Diego, rest his troubled soul, left quite detailed instructions before his departure from this world." Carlos felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" Our mutual friend had a flair for the dramatic, didn't he? Always staging his comebacks when people least expected them. Torres reached into his other pocket, producing an envelope yellowed with age. "He left this for you, specifically requested I deliver it personally." The envelope bore Carlos's name in Maradona's unmistakable scrawl, the same handwriting that had signed 1,000 autographs, 100 contracts, countless promises he'd never kept. The paper felt fragile between Carlos's fingers, as if it might crumble at the slightest pressure. "Read it," Torres urged. "Though I should warn you, Diego's final request might not be what you expect." Through the walls came the sound of running water as the boys began their post-practice showers. Innocent sounds, clean sounds. Everything Carlos had tried to build here felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of a blade he'd thought dulled by time. The gun remained steady in his grip, but his certainty wavered. After 24 years of carrying Elena's death, Diego's ghost had returned with one final move in a game Carlos thought had ended long ago. With one hand gripping the Beretta and the other holding the envelope, Carlos felt trapped between past and present. The yellowed paper seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Or maybe that was just his blood thundering in his ears. Diego's handwriting blurred as memories crashed against the walls he'd so carefully constructed. "Open it," Torres repeated, settling back onto the bench like a theater patron awaiting the final act. "Though I should mention, I've already read it. Had to authenticate Diego's final wishes, you understand. Professional courtesy." Carlos's thumb traced the envelope's edge. The glue had loosened with age, making it easy to lift without tearing. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded once, Diego's words in that familiar scrawl. "Carlos, mi hermano. If you're reading this, then Miguel found you. Good. I told him exactly where to look, though it took him longer than I expected to grow the balls to face you. By now you know the truth about Elena, about that night in Palermo, about how I knew she was investigating Miguel and said nothing, how I chose the drugs over your daughter's life. I've carried her death every day since, but not like you have. You carried it clean, pure grief, pure love. I carried it dirty, mixed with relief that someone else paid the price for my weakness." The page shook in Carlos's grip. Each word felt like a small blade, precise and merciless. Miguel thinks he's here to deliver a message. He doesn't know he is the message. This isn't about forgiveness, Carlos. This is about choice. The same choice I faced 24 years ago and failed. You have 30 seconds before Maria Vega comes through that door. She heard the commotion. She's coming to protect her kids, the same way you always protected me, the same way Elena tried to protect everyone. Choose. Your ghost brother, Diego. Carlos looked up. Torres was checking an expensive watch, that predatory smile never wavering. 28 seconds by my count. The sound of heels clicking against linoleum echoed from the corridor. Quick, determined steps Carlos recognized immediately. Maria, rushing toward what she thought was just another maintenance emergency or teenage scuffle. She had no idea she was walking into the epicenter of a war that had started before most of these kids were born. The beautiful thing about Diego's plan, Torres continued conversationally, is how perfectly he understood all our motivations. He knew I'd come because he promised me something I've wanted for years, closure. He knew you'd draw that gun because you've been rehearsing this moment in your head for 2 decades. 15 seconds. The footsteps drew closer. But did he tell you about the money? Carlos's blood turned to ice water. What money? The $2 million Elena discovered. The reason she really had to die. Torres's smile turned razor sharp. It wasn't about protecting my operation, Carlos. It was about protecting Diego's investment in it. Your sainted football god wasn't just a customer. He was my silent partner. 10 seconds. Elena found the bank records, traced the payments. Diego had been using his image rights money to fund my entire Buenos Aires operation. When she threatened to expose that, Torres shrugged. Well, you know how that ended. Carlos felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. The Diego he'd protected, mourned, idealized, had been complicit in Elena's murder. Not just passively, but actively, financially. 5 seconds. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Carlos? Maria's voice, concerned but not yet alarmed. Is everything all right in there? Torres leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lower that gun. I'm going to finish my coaching contract here, build my new distribution network using these kids as mules. They're perfect. Who suspects 13-year-olds? And you're going to watch it happen. Because if you pull that trigger, if you cause any trouble at all, I'll make sure everyone knows about Diego's money, about how Elena died not as a hero exposing corruption, but as an idealistic fool who never understood that her father's precious saint was the devil all along. The door handle turned slowly. Carlos looked at the gun in his hand, then at the letter, then at the man who'd destroyed everything he'd ever loved. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, he finally understood Diego's final message. This wasn't about justice or revenge or forgiveness. This was about whether Carlos would sacrifice one more innocent life to protect a legend's memory, or finally choose the living over the dead. The door began to open. Time stopped. The door opened in slow motion, Maria's concerned face appearing in the gap. Carlos watched her take in the scene, the gun in his hand, Torres lounging on the bench like he owned the place, the tension crackling between them like a live wire. Her mouth opened to speak, then closed. Those intelligent dark eyes that had seen too many troubled children, too many broken dreams, immediately recognized something was terribly wrong. I'm sorry, she said carefully, stepping back. I thought I heard... You heard correctly, Senora, Torres interrupted, standing with fluid grace. Carlos and I were just discussing old times. Weren't we, Carlos? The gun felt impossibly heavy. Carlos watched Maria's gaze flick to his face, reading the decades of pain written there. She'd always been too perceptive for her own good. It's what made her such a fierce advocate for her students, and what would make her dangerous now. Perhaps I should call... No one, Carlos said quickly. Too quickly. Maria's frown deepened. Torres chuckled. Carlos gets emotional about the past. Don't you, old friend? All those years protecting someone who didn't deserve protection. He moved toward the door, toward Maria, and Carlos felt his finger tighten on the trigger. I was just telling him how much I'm looking forward to working here. Such promising young talent. The way he said talent made Carlos's skin crawl. Behind Maria, he could hear voices in the corridor, kids heading to the showers, probably wondering why their new coach had disappeared mid-introduction. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Everything he'd worked to preserve here crumbling with each passing second. "Carlos," Maria said softly, "why don't you put that away? We can talk about whatever this is." "There's nothing to talk about," Carlos heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but Diego's letter had been clear. Choose. Protect the living, or let the past devour everything good he'd found here. Just a misunderstanding. But even as he said it, he was lowering the gun. Not because he wanted to, but because Torres was right. What choice did he have? Pull the trigger with Maria watching? Let her see him become the monster he'd spent years trying not to be? Turn the academy into another crime scene, another place where innocents went to die? Torres smiled, recognizing victory. See? Just old friends catching up. He moved past Maria into the hallway, pausing to look back. "I should check on the boys. First day nerves, you understand." Maria stepped aside to let him pass, but Carlos saw the way she held herself, ready to move, to act if necessary. She'd spent 15 years protecting these kids from poverty, from violence, from men who saw them as opportunities rather than children. Now she faced something she couldn't identify but clearly feared. Torres disappeared around the corner, his footsteps echoing confidently down the corridor. Carlos holstered the Beretta with shaking hands, but the weight of it against his ribs felt heavier than before, heavier and more useless. Maria closed the door behind her. What just happened here? Nothing. He folded Diego's letter carefully, stuffing it into his pocket. Old business. It's handled. That man, Roberto Silva, he said his name was. There's something wrong about him. The way he looked at the children during introductions. She shivered. And you recognized him. Carlos couldn't meet her eyes. Sometimes the past catches up, that's all. The past that requires guns? She'd seen too much, understood too much. Carlos had always known this might happen, that his history would eventually stain the clean slate he'd tried to build here. But he'd hoped for more time. Years more time, maybe long enough for it not to matter anymore. "I need you to trust me," he said finally. "Can you do that?" Maria studied his face for a long moment. In the silence, they could hear Torres's voice from down the hall, smooth and authoritative as he addressed the boys, talking about discipline, about opportunity, about the bright futures awaiting those who showed proper dedication. The words sounded reasonable, even inspiring. That was what made them so terrifying. "I've trusted you for 4 years," Maria said quietly. "You've never given me reason not to. But this," she gestured toward the door, "if that man is dangerous, he won't hurt the children." Carlos wished he believed it. Not directly. What does that mean? Carlos thought about Torres's words, perfect little mules. Who suspects 13-year-olds? He thought about Elena's bright eyes and fierce determination to save everyone she loved. He thought about Diego's money flowing into operations that destroyed families, funded misery, turned children into casualties. "It means I failed someone once," he said, "and I can't let it happen again." But even as he spoke the words, Carlos felt the trap closing around them all. Torres was here, protected by his false identity and legitimate position. The children were vulnerable, hungry for opportunity, easy to manipulate. And Carlos was just one tired old man carrying too many ghosts and a gun he'd never been willing to use when it mattered most. Outside, practice resumed. Normal sounds returned, but nothing would ever be normal again. Maria remained in the locker room after Carlos's inadequate explanations, her silence more damning than accusations. She moved between the benches, straightening equipment that didn't need straightening, her mind clearly racing through possibilities Carlos wished she'd never have to consider. 4 years, she said finally, not looking at him. 4 years you've been here, and I thought I knew you. The man who stayed late to help Joaquin with his reading, who brought medicine when little Santos had bronchitis and his mother couldn't afford it. Her voice carried a weight of betrayal that cut deeper than Torres's threats. That man wouldn't bring a gun into a place filled with children. Carlos wanted to tell her about Elena, about the promise he'd made at her graveside to never let another innocent pay for his failures. Instead, he watched Maria's reflection in the grimy mirror above the sinks, saw himself through her eyes, perhaps for the first time, not a protector, but a threat. Another dangerous man bringing violence into her sanctuary. You don't understand? Then explain it to me. She turned and Carlos saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Because right now, all I understand is that a man with false credentials shows up claiming to coach our children, and my head of security pulls a gun on him instead of calling police. False credentials. Carlos felt something cold settle in his stomach. What do you mean? I called 3 references from his resume while you two were having your reunion. None of them had heard of Roberto Silva. Maria's administrative instincts had been working even as Carlos drowned in his past. The football academy in Cordoba? They've never had a coach by that name. The youth program in Mendoza doesn't exist. Torres had been careless, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Why maintain a perfect cover when his real protection came from Carlos's silence? The realization made Carlos feel smaller, more trapped. Even Maria's competence was just another piece on Torres's board, another pressure point to ensure compliance. I should have called police immediately, Maria continued. Should have had him removed before he spoke to the children. But I trusted you. Thought maybe you had reasons. She laughed bitterly. God, I actually convinced myself you were protecting us somehow. Through the thin walls they could hear Torres addressing the boys in the main hall. His voice carried that same hypnotic confidence that had once charmed wealthy socialites at Diego's parties, the same seductive authority that had lured Elena into his web of lies. He was explaining his coaching philosophy, discipline, loyalty, the importance of seizing opportunities when they arose. Some of you come from difficult circumstances, Torres was saying. I understand that. I grew up poor too. Sometimes to escape that poverty, we must be willing to take risks others wouldn't understand. Carlos moved toward the door, but Maria caught his arm. Don't. Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. He's recruiting them. Right now, while we stand here talking, he's identifying which boys are desperate enough, hungry enough. Then we call police, file reports, follow proper procedures. But even as she said it, Maria's voice lacked conviction. They both knew how these things worked. Poor kids from the barrios, an academy that barely scraped by on municipal funding, against a man with enough resources to create false identities and buy legitimate positions. He has money, Carlos said quietly. Connections. By the time police finish investigating, he'll be gone and half these kids will be working for him. The bitter truth of it settled between them like poison. The system doesn't protect children like ours, Maria. You know that. She did know it. Carlos could see the recognition in her eyes. How many times had she fought bureaucracy, corruption, indifference to keep the academy running? How many promising students had they lost to drugs, to gangs, to the simple mathematics of poverty? Now Torres offered a shortcut that would damn them all. There has to be another way, she whispered. In the main hall, Torres was wrapping up his introduction. I'll be conducting individual assessments over the coming weeks, learning what motivates each of you, what dreams keep you awake at night. Because dreams, boys, require sacrifice, sometimes from ourselves, sometimes from those who love us. The words hit Carlos like physical blows. Elena had dreamed of justice, of exposing corruption. Her sacrifice had bought nothing but Diego's continued descent and Torres's freedom. Now history prepared to repeat itself with a new generation of dreamers who didn't understand the price of their ambitions. Carlos, Maria said, and he heard in her voice the sound of something breaking. Who was Roberto Silva before he came here? And what did he take from you that's worth destroying everything we've built? The question hung in the air as footsteps approached the locker room door. Torres's voice grew louder, closer. He was coming back, probably to gloat, to cement his victory while the wound was still fresh. Carlos looked at Maria, at her tear-bright eyes, at the photos of graduating students pinned to the bulletin board behind her, at 15 years of dedication about to be perverted into something monstrous, and felt the last of his hope crumble. Diego's final move was more devastating than revenge. It was revelation. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Carlos held his breath, waiting for Torres to enter with that predatory smile, ready to savor his victory. But the footsteps continued past, fading down the corridor toward the main office. Maria exhaled slowly. He's not coming back. Not yet. Carlos pulled Diego's letter from his pocket, staring at the familiar handwriting. 24 years of loyalty, of protecting a man he'd believed was fundamentally good despite his demons. The paper felt like it might crumble to dust in his fingers. But he doesn't need to. He's already won. What is that? Carlos almost folded the letter away again, almost chose silence over the destruction of his last remaining illusion. But Maria deserved the truth, especially if she was going to be collateral damage in Diego's posthumous game. A confession, he said, handing it to her. From someone I thought I knew. Maria read in silence, her face growing paler with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Carlos with something like pity. Your daughter. Elena was investigating a drug operation. Found connections between street dealers and someone with serious money. Bank records, payment schedules, the whole network. Carlos sat heavily on one of the benches, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. She came to me 3 days before she died, excited about her big break. Said she was close to exposing corruption that went all the way to the top. And you told Diego. The words hung between them like an accusation. Carlos nodded slowly. I was proud of her. Wanted to share the good news with the man who'd been like a brother to me for 15 years. Thought maybe it would give him something clean to focus on, help him fight the addiction. Instead, you signed her death warrant. I signed it the moment I chose loyalty over judgment. Carlos thought about all those nights he'd driven Diego to parties where Torres held court, all the times he'd waited outside while deals were made, telling himself his job was protection, not moral policing. Elena died because I enabled the very corruption she was trying to expose. Maria reread the letter, her administrative mind processing the implications. This man, Torres or Silva, whoever he is, he wasn't just Diego's dealer, he was his partner. $2 million over 3 years, image rights money, endorsement fees, appearance payments, all flowing into operations that destroyed families across Buenos Aires. The numbers burned in Carlos's throat. Elena found the trail and died for it. Diego lived with the guilt and said nothing. Until now. Until now, Carlos agreed. When it's safe. When it can't hurt his legacy or cost him anything more than a sleepless grave. Through the walls, they could hear normal academy sounds returning. Showers running, lockers slamming, boys laughing as they changed back into street clothes. The mundane rhythms of adolescent life, unchanged despite the predator now walking among them. You could have told me, Maria said quietly. 4 years, Carlos. 4 years I've trusted you with these children, and you never once mentioned that you were carrying something like this. Would you have hired me? A man whose daughter died because he was too blind to see what he was protecting. Carlos met her eyes. I came here to start over, to prove I could actually protect someone who mattered. Instead, I've led the wolf straight to our door. Maria folded the letter carefully, handing it back to him. What does he want? Really want? A distribution network. Kids from the barrios make perfect mules, desperate enough to take risks, innocent enough to avoid suspicion, isolated enough that nobody important notices when things go wrong. Carlos thought about Torres's smile, the casual way he'd evaluated each boy during introductions. He'll start slow, special coaching sessions, extra opportunities, building trust and dependency. Then small favors, minor rule breaking that seems harmless. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, we'll have created another generation of casualties. Exactly. Maria stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the main field. Practice had ended, but a few boys remained, kicking a ball between makeshift goals, their laughter carrying on the evening air. There has to be something we can do. Some way to stop him without destroying what we've built here. Diego thought so too. That's why he arranged this whole thing. Put us in the same room with the man who killed Elena, gave me a gun and 30 seconds to choose between justice and consequences. Carlos felt the weight of the Beretta against his ribs, heavier now with the knowledge that drawing it would accomplish nothing. But Diego was always better at creating problems than solving them. Maybe that's why he left the choice to you. Carlos looked at her sharply. What do you mean? He could have had Torres arrested, could have provided evidence, testimony, whatever was needed. Instead, he waited until he was dying and set up this confrontation. Maria's voice carried a dawning understanding. He didn't want justice, Carlos. He wanted absolution. Wanted you to either forgive him by letting Torres walk away or damn yourself by pulling that trigger. The truth of it hit Carlos like a physical blow. Even in death, Diego had made it about himself, about his guilt, his need for resolution, his final manipulation of the people who'd loved him. Elena's murder, the children's safety, Carlos's torment, all just pieces in a dead man's selfish game of redemption. Bastard, Carlos whispered, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For the first time in 24 years, the weight of protecting Diego's memory lifted from his shoulders. The silence stretched between them, heavy with revelation and rage. Carlos felt hollow, as if the anger burning through him had consumed everything else. 24 years of loyalty, grief, and self-hatred reduced to ash. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he'd kept but never called. "What are you doing?" Maria asked. "Something I should have done the day Elena died." Carlos pressed the number for Inspector Raul Vega, Homicide Division, the man who'd investigated his daughter's murder, who'd suspected connections that Carlos had helped bury beneath lies and misdirection. Vega answered on the third ring. "Carlos? Cristo, it's been, 20 years? 24. Carlos watched through the window as the last boys gathered their equipment, innocent laughter echoing across the field. "I have information about Elena's case, about who really killed her." A pause. "Carlos, the case is closed. Has been for... I know who gave the order, who paid for it, and I know where to find him." The words felt like broken glass in his throat. "But I need something from you first. I'm listening. The drug operation Elena was investigating. Do you still have her files, her evidence?" Another pause, longer this time. When Vega spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of a man who'd spent decades walking the line between justice and politics. Elena's files were comprehensive, more than we ever made public, but without corroborating testimony. "You'll have it, but I need those files tonight, and I need to know exactly what evidence you'd require to reopen not just Elena's murder, but the entire network she uncovered." "Carlos, what's going on? You sound... different?" Carlos almost laughed. "I'm done protecting dead men's secrets, Raul. Elena deserved better. These kids deserve better." He looked at Maria, saw her watching him with something between hope and terror. "How long would you need to build a case? If you had everything? Testimony, financial records, witness statements?" "Depends on how deep the corruption goes. If we're talking about reopening a decades-old murder and connecting it to ongoing criminal enterprise," Vega's voice sharpened with professional interest, "could take months, years if the suspects have serious resources." "They do, but they also have something they didn't have before, proximity to their own destruction." Carlos felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. Diego's final manipulation transformed into something resembling justice. "Can you meet me tonight? Bring Elena's files, and come prepared to work through the weekend." "Carlos, one more thing. The suspect is currently operating under the identity Roberto Silva. He's taken a position at the Academia Esperanza in San Telmo. I need you to run background checks, verify his credentials, find out how deep the false identity goes." "Jesus Christ." Vega's voice dropped to a whisper. "You found him. After all these years, you actually found Elena's killer." "He found me." Carlos ended the call and turned to Maria. "We have maybe 48 hours before Torres realizes what's happening and disappears again. What do you need me to do?" "Keep him close. Act normal. Let him think his plan is working." Carlos felt the weight of the Beretta against his ribs, but now it felt different. Not a burden of failed protection, but a tool he might finally use correctly. "Can you do that?" Maria nodded slowly. "The boys will be safe. I promise you that." He meant it. Felt the certainty of it burning in his chest where Diego's guilt used to live. but I need to ask something difficult of you. What? Torres is going to want to start his recruitment soon. Special sessions, private meetings with the boys he thinks are most vulnerable. Carlos hated what he was about to propose, but saw no other way. Let him. You're insane. I'm tactical. We need evidence of criminal intent, proof that he's actively recruiting minors for drug operations. Without that, the best we can do is expose his false identity and watch him vanish before police can connect him to anything serious. Maria stared at him. You want to use the children as bait. I want to use myself as bait. But yes, the children will be at risk. Carlos thought about Elena's bright determination, her belief that exposing corruption was worth any personal cost. It's what she would have done. Elena was an adult. These are 13-year-old boys who will spend their lives as victims unless someone stops this. Carlos pulled out his phone again. I'm calling Vega back, having him position surveillance teams around the academy. The moment Torres makes his move, actually solicits criminal activity from a minor, we'll have him. But even as he spoke the words, Carlos felt the familiar weight of protecting others' innocence while risking their destruction. The same choice that had killed Elena now faced him again, wearing different faces but carrying identical stakes. Through the window, he watched the last boy disappear into the evening shadows of San Telmo, unaware that tomorrow would begin the most dangerous game of his young life. The call to Vega felt like stepping off a cliff. Carlos stared at his phone, thumb hovering over the contact, when footsteps echoed in the corridor again, slower this time, deliberate. Torres was returning. Hide the letter, Carlos whispered to Maria, but she was already moving, slipping Diego's confession into her desk drawer. The door opened without a knock. Ah, still here. Torres stepped inside, his predatory smile wider now, more confident. I wanted to thank you both for the warm welcome. The boys seem very responsive to new opportunities. Carlos felt his hand drift toward the Beretta, muscle memory from 15 years of protecting Diego overriding rational thought. But Maria's sharp intake of breath stopped him. Not here. Not like this. They're good kids, Maria said carefully. They work hard. I can see that. Especially young Miguel. Such intensity, such hunger for something better. Torres's eyes never left Carlos's face. Reminds me of someone I knew once. A girl who thought she could change the world through sheer determination. The words hit like physical blows. Carlos felt 24 years of carefully constructed numbness cracking, exposing the raw wound beneath. Torres knew exactly what he was doing, twisting the knife, savoring each moment of recognition and rage. Elena was naive, Torres continued, settling into a chair as if he belonged there. Believed that exposing corruption was some kind of noble crusade. Never understood that the system exists precisely because people with power want it that way. Stop. The word tore from Carlos's throat before he could prevent it. She came to my hotel that night so confident, so righteous. Had photographs, financial records, even recorded conversations. Torres laughed softly. Thought she was exposing a drug dealer. Never realized she was threatening a business partner of Diego fucking Maradona. Carlos lunged forward, but Maria caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Torres didn't even flinch, just sat there smiling, savoring the moment he'd been planning for 24 years. You want to know the beautiful irony? Diego never intended for her to die. He just wanted the investigation stopped, thought a little intimidation would scare her off. Torres examined his fingernails with theatrical casualness. But Elena was stubborn, started making threats about going public regardless of consequences. So I made a decision that protected us both. You murdered my daughter to save Diego's reputation. I murdered your daughter to save a multi-million-dollar operation that employed hundreds of people and funded half the charities in Buenos Aires. Torres leaned forward, his mask finally slipping to reveal something cold and merciless beneath. One idealistic journalist against an empire that brought joy to millions. The mathematics were simple. Maria's grip on Carlos's arm tightened, the only thing preventing him from drawing his weapon. But Torres wasn't finished. He'd waited too long for this moment to waste it on efficiency. The guilt ate at Diego for years. started using more, drinking more, making mistakes that cost us both money. By the end, he was barely functional, just a broken old man who couldn't live with what he'd helped me do. Torres stood, straightening his jacket. That's why he arranged this little reunion. Thought if he confessed everything, gave you a chance at revenge, it might finally ease his conscience. Even in death, making it about himself. Carlos whispered. Exactly. Diego never cared about Elena, or you, or anyone except his own precious legacy. This whole elaborate scheme, bringing me here, setting up our confrontation, it's just his final performance. The truth of it settled over Carlos like poison. Even Elena's justice had been subordinated to Diego's need for absolution, her murder transformed into just another prop in the great man's eternal drama. But here's what Diego never understood, Torres continued. I don't need his protection anymore. The drug landscape has evolved, Carlos. These children represent a new kind of opportunity, not just distribution, but recruitment, training, a pipeline of young talent molded from the beginning. Carlos felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The weight of Diego's betrayal, carried for so long it had become part of his skeleton, suddenly lifted. In its place burned something cleaner, more focused. You made one mistake, he said quietly. Torres raised an eyebrow. Only one? You assumed I'm still the same broken man who let Elena die. Carlos straightened, feeling 24 years of self-hatred crystallize into pure purpose. But I'm not protecting Diego anymore. I'm not carrying his guilt, or preserving his secrets, or playing by his rules. He pulled out his phone, thumb moving to the call log. I'm protecting those children, and I've already made the call that ends you. Torres's smile faltered for the first time. What call? The one that brings Elena's files out of storage. The one that puts surveillance teams around this academy. The one that turns you from hunter into hunted. Carlos felt Diego's ghost finally release its grip on his soul. You see, Elena kept copies of everything, and now her evidence has a living witness willing to testify. In the distance, sirens began to wail. The sirens grew louder, and Torres's mask cracked completely. His confident smile twisted into something feral as he reached for the door, but Carlos stepped into his path. Leaving so soon? Carlos's voice carried a calm he hadn't felt in decades. After 24 years, I thought you'd want to stay and finish our conversation. You have no idea what you've done. Torres's eyes darted between Carlos and the window, calculating escape routes. The connections I have, the protection, are all tied to a dead man's reputation. Carlos pulled out his phone, showing Torres the screen. Vega's number, call duration, 47 minutes. Amazing how cooperative old friends become when you offer them the case that defined their career. Through the window, the first police car pulled into the academy's narrow courtyard, followed by another. Maria moved to open the door, but Carlos raised a hand, stopping her. Not yet. Let him understand first. Torres straightened his jacket, some of his composure returning. You think this changes anything? You think arresting me brings Elena back or absolves you of your failures? He laughed, but the sound was brittle now, desperate. You're still the man who chose Diego's secrets over his daughter's safety. That guilt dies with you, Carlos. For a moment, the old weight threatened to settle back onto Carlos's shoulders. 24 years of self-hatred, of wondering what would have happened if he'd chosen differently that night. But then he thought of Miguel's laugh, of all the boys who would walk through these doors tomorrow, trusting adults to protect them. You're right, Carlos said quietly. I failed Elena. Failed her completely. He felt tears he'd buried for decades finally surface. But I won't fail these children. The knock came firm and authoritative. Maria opened the door to reveal Inspector Vega, older now but still carrying himself with the careful dignity Carlos remembered from Elena's funeral. Behind him stood two younger detectives, their eyes already cataloging the room, marking Torres as the primary suspect. Carlos Vega's voice carried 24 years of unfinished business. Roberto Silva, I presume? Torres straightened, his survival instincts kicking in. Inspector, I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. I'm a football coach, recently hired by... You're Fernando Torres, wanted for questioning in 17 unsolved homicides between 1994 and 2018. Vega's voice cut through the pretense like a blade. Elena Mendez was just the beginning, wasn't she? Carlos felt his legs weaken. 17. Elena hadn't been Torres's only victim, just the one that mattered to a washed-up bodyguard whose testimony had finally given the police what they needed. The Roberto Silva identity was masterful, Vega continued, producing handcuffs. Valid credentials, employment history, even references that checked out. Almost perfect, except for one detail, which was... Torres's voice remained steady, but sweat beaded his forehead. The real Roberto Silva died in a car accident in 1995, 1 year after Elena's murder. Vega smiled grimly. His body was never found, but his documents apparently lived on. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound like absolution. Torres looked directly at Carlos as they led him toward the door, his eyes promising that this wasn't over, that connections and corruption would eventually free him. But Carlos felt no fear, only a profound exhaustion, as if a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its burden had finally been lifted. When the police cars disappeared into the Buenos Aires night, Carlos found himself alone with Maria in the suddenly quiet office. The academy felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Torres's presence had been a shadow Carlos hadn't noticed until it was gone. "What happens now?" Maria asked. Carlos walked to the window overlooking the main field, where tomorrow the boys would return to chase their dreams across worn grass, unaware of how close they'd come to having those dreams twisted into nightmares. "Now we do what Elena always believed in," he said quietly. "We protect the innocent and tell the truth, even when it costs us everything." He pulled Diego's letter from his pocket, reading it one final time before folding it carefully and placing it in Maria's hands. "This belongs in Elena's file. Evidence of how corruption works, how it spreads, how it uses loyalty as a weapon against justice." Carlos felt Diego's ghost finally release its grip on his soul. Let the investigators decide what Diego's legacy becomes. Outside, Buenos Aires hummed with its eternal rhythms. Tango music drifting from distant clubs, the scent of grilled meat, the laughter of young people who still believe the world could be changed by those brave enough to try. Carlos thought of Elena, of her fierce determination and uncompromising hope. For the first time in 24 years, he felt worthy of being her father. The weight was gone. In its place, something like peace.